frost hadn't touched the ground yet, but Caleb's hands were already cold. He stood at the edge of the yard, watching a wagon fill up with everything his family owned. Not much. A cracked stove, a few boards, his father's hammer, the ash handle worn smooth from years of gripping. 3 weeks ago, his father was still breathing. Now the house behind him wasn't his anymore. It never had been, not on paper. His father had said the land would go to Caleb one day. Said it plain, said it more than once. But a spoken word doesn't hold up a barn roof, and it doesn't stop a woman with a deed from doing what she wants with what's hers. Marguerite didn't look at him while she worked. She had a list in her head, and she was moving through it. Debts first, then the sale, then Cheyenne, where her own son waited with a spare room and no interest in feeding 3 extra mouths through a Wyoming winter. "You'll want the tools sold separate," she said. Not quite a question. "Fetch more that way." Caleb didn't answer. He watched his daughter, Junie, stand near the old horse with a cloth sack hugged to her chest, staring up at the house like she expected it to say something back to her. His wife, Rosalind, was already on the wagon, folding what little cloth they had left into neat, tight squares. She wasn't crying. She hadn't cried since the funeral. She just worked with her jaw set, like grief was something you could fold small enough to carry. When the wagon was loaded, Marguerite finally looked at Junie, just for a second, then turned her face east, toward the road to town. Caleb could have argued, could have stood in that yard and shouted about promises made at a deathbed, but shouting doesn't make a deed appear. He had no money for a lawyer, no paper with his name on it, and a home won through a fight in a judge's office would never feel safe to sleep in anyway. So he laid his hand flat against the old gelding's neck, gripped his father's hammer until his knuckles paled, and clicked his tongue to get the horse moving. He didn't look back at the house, not once. He didn't point the wagon toward town either. Town cost money they didn't have, and winter was already leaning in from the north. Instead, he pointed it toward a place his father used to talk about, a stretch of dead railroad called Cottonwood Spur, forgotten when the company moved its line years back, a depot nobody used, a grain shed, a stone barn with half a roof, and somewhere out there, sitting on rusted rails that led nowhere, a boxcar nobody had ever bothered to haul away. It took 3 days to get there. Rosalind walked beside the horse, on every uphill stretch, to spare his legs. Junie kept a hand on the cracked stove whenever the wagon jolted, like she could hold it together through sheer will. The land they passed was already dying toward winter. Broken fences, a blind windmill missing every blade, birds cutting south overhead in long, ragged lines. On the second afternoon, the horse started swinging his rear toward the north wind every time they stopped, ears pinned back. Rosalind noticed. She didn't say anything. When Junie finally asked if they were going home, Caleb chose his words slow and careful. "There's a place with walls still standing. If the frame's good, we start there." They reached Cottonwood Spur as the light was dying on the 3rd day. Grass had swallowed most of the old rail bed, and there it was, a single wooden boxcar, tilted hard to one side, sitting on tracks that hadn't felt a train in years. Beyond it, a grain shed missing half its roof, a stone barn open on one side, a well buried under years of dead branches. The boxcar leaned nearly 3 inches out of level. Its door hung crooked on a bent rail. When Caleb finally knocked the rusted latch loose with the flat of his father's hammer, dust rolled out in a gray wave, and something small and fast scattered across the rotten floorboards. Rosalind pulled Junie back by the shoulder. The old horse startled at the sound, and stamped once, hard. Caleb stepped inside anyway. He ran his palm along one of the upright posts, feeling for rot, forgive, for anything that would tell him this was hopeless. The wood held. "It isn't dead," he said quietly, mostly to himself. "First, we make it stand." Behind him, Junie was already pulling a short length of red thread from her mother's sewing kit, tying it to the edge of a torn canvas flap without being asked why. She just wanted to see which way the wind was going to fight them from. The next morning, a man with a limp and a brass ruler came walking up along the dead tracks, like he already knew what he'd find. He didn't offer his name right away. He just circled the leaning boxcar twice, tapping the sunken axle with an iron-tipped cane, and said, "Lift one end too far. You'll twist this frame for good." Caleb told him he'd never raised a railroad car in his life. "Figured," the old man said. "Name's Ezra Kettle. Used to keep this line running before the company forgot it existed." He nodded toward the tool shed. "There's a screw jack in there, if the mice haven't chewed through the handle." They worked it slow, half an inch at a time, stone blocks under the frame, oak wedges checked and rechecked, Junie stretching a measuring tape, while Rosalind marked each rise with a small stone. By sundown, the car had lifted barely an inch. "Feels slow," Caleb admitted, wiping his palms on his trousers. "Old timber doesn't hurry for anybody," Ezra said. It was Caleb who broke the rule, not the wood. On the second day, with Ezra back at his cabin for more wedges, he pushed the eastern side higher than they'd agreed, impatient, watching frost creep across the shaded ground at noon like a clock running out. The stone stack shifted in the soft earth. A block slipped. The whole car lurched 2 inches sideways, the door slamming hard against its rail. Rosalind's hand closed around his arm and yanked him back, a half-second before the timber would have taken his fingers. Ezra came back to find the ground torn up and said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Building your family a home or racing the winter to prove something?" They tore it all down and started over. Gravel first, wider stones, 2 wedges instead of 1 greedy one. By the third evening, a bowl of water sat level on the floor. The roof came next, and it taught Caleb the same lesson from a different direction. He patched the 3 holes with sheet metal pulled from the collapsed grain shed, sealed with pine pitch and ash, and let his confidence get ahead of his judgment, leaving one seam facing the wrong way because he liked how the curve shed water in his head. Rain found the mistake before he did. It crept under the northern seam and dripped straight onto the corner Rosalind had swept clean for sleeping. Junie set a pot beneath it, but the water just found a new path along the beam. Caleb climbed back up the next morning and pulled 3 panels loose. The seal was fine. The direction was wrong. He turned every seam away from the wind this time, nailed the high edges down tight, and kept the sealant inside the joints instead of smeared across the top like paint. The second storm left 1 damp ring around a nail. Nothing more. Smoke nearly finished what the cold couldn't. The first fire in the patched-up stove rolled backward through the door the moment Caleb sealed the boxcar tight against drafts. Rosalind had Junie outside before the air turned bad. Nobody spoke for a while after that. It was Junie who found the answer, without meaning to. Watching her red thread, she noticed it leaned toward the stove whenever the door stood open, and hung dead still the moment it closed. Caleb cut a small vent low near the floor. Rosalind insisted on a second one, high on the far wall, for the air to leave by. The next fire climbed clean and straight, and behind the hanging curtain that split the room, the thread barely stirred at all. They had just started calling the place something like home when the wagon came. Barrett Coyle didn't step down right away. He sat up on the bench and looked over the mended roof, the standing well, the smoke rising straight from the chimney, like a man counting coins that weren't his yet. "You've done good work fixing up land that isn't yours," he said finally. He had papers, old debt, tied to boundary lines that had vanished with the fences years ago. He'd drawn those lines generously, straight through the well, the yard, the barn. Caleb asked him to measure from the center of the old rail line instead. Barrett refused outright. Men without deeds don't get to ask where the border sits. He gave them 10 days. 2 days before that deadline, hauling salvaged fence timber home with the horse, a chain slipped. A rolling beam caught the gelding's hind leg and opened it to the bone. Caleb got a tourniquet on fast enough to matter, walking the animal home one slow step at a time, while blood soaked through the wrapping. Ezra crouched by the wound that evening and said the tendon was likely to hold, but the horse wouldn't pull a wagon again for days. Maybe longer. Caleb sat with that a long moment. If Barrett forced them out now, they had no way to carry anything. And out past the tree line, the sky had already gone the flat, heavy gray that old-timers didn't like the look of. Rosalind stood in the doorway behind him, arms crossed against the cold. "The west wall doesn't have to match anything," she said. "It just has to stop the wind." That night, they started nailing it shut with whatever they had left. They built the west wall from whatever the farm still owed them. Old shed doors, sacks stuffed with dry grass, 2 warped planks Marguerite had let them keep out of pity or carelessness, wire twisted tight at every seam. It looked wrong, patched and lopsided, and nothing like the rest of the car. Junie tied her red thread against it anyway, and it barely moved. That night, Caleb sat in the stone barn with his hand resting on the horse's neck, while Junie changed the bandage by lantern light. His father's house was gone, but his father's horse was breathing easy in a shelter Caleb had raised with his own 2 hands, and there was nowhere left to send either of them. Barrett came back the next afternoon with a wagon full of stakes and paper, and a sky behind him already spitting fine, dry snow sideways across the frozen ground. He handed over a new notice: stop using the well, the shed, the yard, and looked pointedly at the horse's wrapped leg. He knew exactly what that injury meant for a family that couldn't walk out with a wagon full of belongings. "You've still got legs to walk to the settlement," he said. Caleb looked past him at the darkening west. "Storm's coming. Law doesn't wait on weather." Barrett nailed the notice to the shed door himself. Rosalind walked out with a full bucket from the well and set it down in front of him without a word wasted. "Will you stand guard on this through a blizzard, just to keep a child from drawing water?" Barrett said nothing. He turned his wagon east instead, hurrying to beat the storm home. He didn't make it. A crosswind caught his wagon on the open grade, less than a mile out, and the front wheel dropped hard into a frozen rut. His clerk went down in the snow and came up cradling a broken wrist. By the time they looked back toward the tracks, everything behind them had gone white, except one small amber light, still burning, still visible. They had nowhere else to go. Caleb let them in only as far as the curtain, and only after the snow was brushed off and the boots came away from the door. Barrett stood inside the boxcar and looked around without a word. The raised bed, the dry inner wall, the split firewood stacked by the entrance, water divided into small jars instead of one barrel that could freeze solid and useless. The storm ran 4 days. On the second morning, snow had climbed halfway up the door, and the wind found the patched west wall exactly where a single grass sack had slipped loose. Caleb and Rosalind tore the panel open, reset it, wired it tighter than before. The thread went still again. By the 3rd day, the woodpile looked thinner than Caleb liked, but Junie's careful tally on the board showed something better than he expected. They were burning less each night, not more. The still air trapped in the walls was doing its job, letting the stove rest between burns instead of fighting the cold all night long. Late that night, something struck the roof hard enough to bring everyone upright. Not a beam giving way, just a slab of packed snow sliding clean off metal that had finally been laid the right direction, taking its weight with it instead of piling onto the frame. On the fourth morning, the wind simply stopped. Nobody cheered. The quiet said enough on its own. When the drifts were finally cut through, neighbors came to look. Wesley Crane walked the boxcar slowly, knuckles testing the inner wall, eyes on the firewood count, and offered no apology, only questions about how far the insulation sat from the outer boards. It was the clerk, wrist still splinted, who spoke first to the gathered crowd. He told them plainly that Barrett had nailed an eviction notice to that shed door with a blizzard bearing down, and that this family had pulled him out of the snow and warmed his broken hand anyway. He also admitted, in front of everyone, that Barrett had never been able to say exactly where his boundary line actually sat. Ezra didn't wait to be asked twice. He stretched his tape from the old railroad marker toward the center of the dead track, and the number didn't match a single line Barrett had claimed. Caleb pulled the notice off the well post. He didn't tear it up. He just laid it back in Barrett's wagon, quiet, final. Surviving the storm wasn't the end of it for Caleb. Once the roads opened, he rode with Ezra and Rosalind to the Territorial Records Office, where a young clerk almost waved the old railroad files away as irrelevant, until Ezra recognized the company name printed across them, one that had stopped existing before Barrett's debt was ever purchased. Railroad land, they learned, was always measured from the center of the track, not from fences that had rotted away years ago. Days of comparing old maps and dissolution papers proved it clean. Barrett held real claim to the grain shed and the eastern fields. He held nothing at all beneath the boxcar. That narrow strip had reverted to the territory the day the line closed, and the well sat almost exactly on the seam between the two. The judge's ruling was simple. Barrett couldn't remove them. Ownership itself would have to be earned properly, through application, once the territory opened the parcel for Homestead. When the papers finally reached their table, Caleb slid them across to Rosalind first. She read every line before signing her name. Only then did he sign his beside it. The law had only just caught up to what the winter already knew. Spring came slow, but it came. The grain shed rose again as a storehouse. Rosalind's garden spread wider, from seeds a stranded family had left behind, one hard night. Junie kept her records going. Lowest temperatures, armloads of wood, the water level in the well, long after anyone needed her to. From Cheyenne, months later, a small box arrived with no letter of apology inside it. Just an old carpenter's square that had been Caleb's father's. He set it down next to the hammer and let it be nothing more than that. Ezra passed peacefully some years on. They buried him under the cottonwoods with an old railroad tie for a marker, and Junie kept his brass ruler on the same shelf as her thread. Every evening after, she lit the amber lantern and hung it on the same hook her father had fixed that first cold week. The rails never carried another train, but travelers passing through the dark always knew what that light meant. Someone was still awake out there. Someone was home.